Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. This is the Intel update for June 23rd through the 29th, 2024. So let's get right to it. Beginning with the Northeast region, a lot of things coming out of Washington, D.C. these days with all these recent Supreme Court rulings, but one that I kind of wanted to touch on because it may or may not affect some people out there is the overturning of what has colloquially become known as the Chevron doctrine. So this is kind of a little bit of a rabbit hole, so please bear with me for a moment. The Chevron doctrine, as it has become known, is basically a landmark court ruling that goes back to the 80s, which basically allowed a lot of federal agencies leeway in determining what a law actually is. So as we all know, Congress writes laws, Congress makes laws, Congress passes laws. The executive branch of the government is supposed to interpret those laws and put them into practice. Well, turns out not every little tiny technical minute detail of a law as passed by Congress is included in the actual text of the bill. So in theory, at least, when the executive branch goes to implement a law, there are tiny little technical details or problems that may come up. The law may be a little bit ambiguous because the laws are not being made by technical experts. And as a result, there were a few cases that have come up over time, the Chevron doctrine case being one of them, that allows the federal government, the executive branch of the federal government and federal agencies to kind of nitpick and sort of write law themselves, right? They're able to interpret what a law actually is and how it sort of applies because of allegedly the technical nature. Now, anyone who is a purveyor of the firearms community in the United States of America knows how this sort of worked out when it comes to the ATF. As most people who would probably be watching this video already know, agencies like the ATF basically just make up law. They just make up rules that the American public now has to follow, and they're an unelected body. People in the radio community might also realize that the FCC does this the same exact way. The difference being is that the ATF kind of doesn't really do it under the Chevron doctrine so much. They just do it underneath, well, they just do it because. But, other agencies like the FDA, the USDA, things like this, laws get passed. So they're supposed to interpret how these laws work, and put them into practice, using the Chevron doctrine as a sort of precedent. Well, because of this, I've seen estimates that say that roughly 18,000 federal laws and federal judgments have been impacted by this judgment. So you've got a case that comes forward and says, hey, the citizenry says this is illegal, this agency's making law, they're not supposed to make law. So the court strikes it down, citing Chevron doctrine. So you see where this might start to become a problem. It seems like I've seen estimates that say roughly 18,000 laws or regulations it's hard to get a good data point, but I've seen estimates that say that, potentially tens, if not hundreds of thousands of regulations, laws, or either one of the two, have been impacted by Chevron doctrine. Well, the Supreme Court just overruled it and said it's wrong. Federal agencies cannot add to or detract from law. The law must be applied as it is written and approved by an elected body. Well, this has caused absolute pandemonium and widespread panic of an apocalyptic nature amongst most Washington, D.C., apparatchik kind of organizations. There is a very large sector within the Washington, D.C. sort of, beltway ideology that has created multi-billion-dollar corporations with the sole purpose of interpreting law, basically writing law under the Chevron doctrine, under the authorities granted to various federal agencies because of that. And now the Supreme Court has overthrown this. I'm not going to say our entire, government bureaucracy is going to crumble overnight. There's far too many other regulations that take up where Chevron leaves off, and I'm sure that the federal agencies are just going to ignore this because there's no penalty for ignoring the Supreme Court these days. But this is a pretty serious blow to the Washington bureaucracy. It's sort of like one of those things where nobody really expected it, and now that it's happened, nobody really knows what to do. or how bad this can be for the Washington elites. I'm mostly just because I have a very pessimistic outlook on specific, legalities within the government, bureaucracy. I'm not really jumping for joy right now because of this. But I will say that generally speaking, it's probably a positive thing if you are an American taxpayer and you don't really appreciate Washington elites writing laws or federal agencies writing laws that Congress hasn't passed. If that's your viewpoint, fine. This is probably a good thing for you. I just don't have really any faith that the agencies are going to go by it. But in any case, I did want to mention it and kind of go down this rabbit hole a little bit because this may start impacting things, and this may have second and third order effects that we can't really predict right now. So it's really hard to say how this is going to affect the American population, but I can say that it probably will affect most people in some way. So moving on from there, down in the southeast, I did want to briefly mention in Kentucky some rather sad news. Unfortunately, Representative Thomas Massey's wife has unexpectedly passed away. She passed away the day before yesterday in Kentucky, and there haven't really been any details about that. So I just wanted to kind of mention it, and just for posterity's sake, I guess. And just, kind of point out how this rather unfortunate story. But moving on from there, moving out to the east central Midwestern region, again, another train derailment. You guys probably heard about this one in the southern part of Chicago, just on the city outskirts down there in Madison. It was a pretty good pileup, a pretty good train derailment, and there was one car of LPG that did leak. However, there was basically nothing that happened from that, thankfully. Now, I did want to mention this incident just because it's a really good reminder to be aware. There's really no, at this time, indication that this derailment was the result of anything nefarious. However, there is growing sentiment and there's growing concern that rail logistics are being targeted by malign actors throughout the United States. Now, I really don't want to get down into the weeds too much with this, but I do want to encourage everyone to just kind of please be aware. Please be aware that people have figured out, especially a lot of these more direct action activist groups have figured out the importance of logistics. They've figured out a lot of things that we don't really necessarily want to talk about so much because it might give malign actors some really bad ideas, if you know what I mean. But they figured out a lot of this stuff. They're talking all over social media about how to take down American infrastructure. They're able to publish all of this content, including guides and manuals and other kind of educational content of an insurgent variety, just to be, perfectly honest. And there's very little interest for, various federal agencies to, kind of maybe do their job on checking some of this out. There is some interest, but for the most part, it's ideologically based. So, like we all know how events around the world have kind of transpired, and how bad behavior on one group's part is investigated very, very heavily, but bad behavior on another group's part is completely ignored. And this creates a huge disparity in the counterterrorism world, where you look at a political group and you say, okay, they're, my political enemy, if I'm, in an agency, right? They're my political enemy, and I'm going to start investigating them, but I'm going to ignore these people over here who are allegedly, on the same side, but they're connecting a lot of bad behavior as well that is very, very risky from a, counterterrorism standpoint. So I know that's kind of a very vague way of describing things, but really it doesn't do me any good to talk about this stuff anymore. So I'll just say, just please be careful, please be observant. Please note that it may not necessarily be the traditional boogeyman bad guys that are out there doing very bad stuff. The malign actors that we typically think of in stereotypical fashion might not be the culprit in every single case. So just be advised on that front. So let's move on to the West Central Midwest. Again, something that's, a lot of people don't really necessarily think about. When we're too busy, looking for the boogeyman, sometimes we kind of ignore natural disasters that are truly natural disasters, like rainfall. I know flooding season occurs pretty much every year. However, every year it seems like a lot of people tend to forget that just because you may not live in a place that floods frequently doesn't mean that a freak weather event can occur. So the severe flooding throughout the Midwest, even either the West Central Midwest or the East Central Midwest, the whole region really has just kind of been suffering the effects of flooding and the effects of crumbling infrastructure. So there are several dams and levees and abutment operations that have either been compromised or they're looking like they're getting ready to be compromised. So if you are in the area, you probably already know about this, so I'm not going to rehash it. But again, this is just a reminder of how important critical infrastructure is and how, it doesn't really get a whole lot of attention to, want to increase funding for, a dam project or a levee project. But, when you find out that the dam has been in a state of disrepair for 10, 20 years, now suddenly it's a problem. So, again, something to keep in mind. People who are in the area of these flooding zones that are affected by this already know, so I'm not going to, again, go into too many details. But, again, this is just a very, very strong reminder to please be aware of the critical infrastructure around you, especially if it is in a state of disrepair. Moving down south, moving down to South America. Sorry, I don't have a dedicated map for this just yet. I'm still downloading some high-resolution imagery data. But just to briefly touch on the Bolivian coup attempt, basically this was just kind of a one-shot deal. Bolivia is no stranger to coup attempts in the area, but they don't normally succeed so well. So again, Bolivia in general thinks he can run the country better than the president. Launches a coup attempt. A couple hours later, he doesn't really get the support that he wanted. There was only mobilization to sort of overthrow the president from a few soldiers. It wasn't really a whole widespread thing, and it certainly wasn't any other government departments throughout Bolivia. So again, the coup was shut down just as fast as it started. Of course, anytime there's a coup anywhere in the world, you have to wonder if the CIA's fingerprints are all over it, and I can't say for certain. I haven't dug into it too much, but I think that you could, probably guess the CIA was the result, the cause of it, and probably be 99% right. Who knows? But again, just, election year in the U.S. means that it's coup season pretty much everywhere else in the world, so something to keep in mind, mostly because Bolivia exports a whole lot of lithium. And they recently discovered a very large lithium deposit or, lithium reserves down there in their terrain. So that's not in it. That's, in addition to the very important role that Bolivia plays with regards to the cartels and immigration and the drug trade and stuff like that. So again, the tangled web of politics down in South America is very, very hard to explain. It would take hours just to get through the introduction to it. But something to keep on the lookout for is nefarious activities going on around the world. And speaking of highly questionable things going on around the world, let's talk very, very briefly about the Ukrainian missile strike in Sevastopol, or Sevastopol, depending on how you wanted to pronounce it. Old Soviet town, been around for a very long time down there in Crimea. The short version of the story is Ukraine launched an ATACMS missile strike on either, depending on which source you read, it's either the airfield, the other airfield, or the naval base there, or military targets within the city proper. I don't know what the actual target was. It seems like it was probably a much more widespread operation, which I'll get to in a moment. Anyway, Ukraine launches a missile strike, kills a bunch of civilians on the beach and in the city because Russia, of course, has exceptionally superior missile defense in this area, and they've had it since really 2014, 2016 timeframe. Of course, intercepted these rather, slow-flying missiles. Missiles break up in flight. These submunitions or the boosters or the debris from the missile lands on the civilians, kills a lot of people in Russia or in Crimea, however you wanted to phrase it. And that's really the big deal. Another sort of detail that kind of went missed by the Western media is that there was an American RQ-4 Global Hawk flying around at the same time, and Russia is probably, or rather, I don't know if Russian like state-affiliated media, I don't know what they're saying about it, but like pro-Russia social media accounts are saying the Americans directly provided targeting data, which resulted in the deaths of Russian civilians. Huge escalation inbound, right? Well, just to kind of calm things down a little bit and temper the situation a little bit, Russia has responded to this so far with a decently traditionally Russian icy sort of cool response. So Russia knows, or can probably guess, I think even their state media has stated that Ukraine didn't deliberately target civilians this time in this specific strike. The civilians that were killed were killed because the missiles were intercepted. So at least Russia's going with this. Various pro-Russia or Russia-affiliated social media accounts are claiming the opposite because Russian divers have been in the waters off the beach, and they've allegedly found a lot of submunitions, showing that or rather, sort of strongly indicating that the missile variant that was used was of a cluster munition variety. So that brings out a whole other rabbit hole that I'm sure nobody really cares to go down. However, the general thing that I think a lot of American taxpayers are asking is, how bad is this? Is this going to be an escalation, and what does this mean for me? For the most part, it's probably not that bad of an escalation. Probably not as severe as a lot of the outrage-based media sort of wants it to be. It's not good. It's definitely not good, especially the American drone being in the area at the same time. That looks real bad. Now, Russia probably knows that the United States is not bold enough to provide targeting data, first of all, from that far away to Sevastopol Naval Base or the airfield there. I mean, I would be the first one to call out sort of nefarious behavior on the part of the Americans in Ukraine. However, it's really not that likely for the assets that the Americans had in the area to be involved in this strike directly. Now, of course, they probably gave the intel to the Ukrainians that resulted in the strike in the first place, but for the most part, this isn't a World War III sort of thing to where the Americans have now bombed Sevastopol like a lot of media is saying. This is not the case. This is an escalation. It is Ukraine using munitions the Americans provided. And if we recall for a moment, we went from Ukraine is not allowed to use American munitions outside of Ukraine. We went from that to, okay, they can now use them in Kherson. Okay, to now they can start targeting targets inside Russia, and now we've had them target a very Civcas heavy target in Sevastopol. So that shows you, one, how nasty this war is and how quickly it's escalating already this year and how bad the summer is going to be. And two, it shows you, it really strongly implies the sticky situation that Ukraine is in. And if you're going to go this fast, Ukraine basically immediately has taken everything the West has given them and thrown it right into battle, right? So it's very, very much a case of showing how desperate Ukraine is. I know a lot of people disagree with that, but whatever, I don't care. However, one main sort of narrative point the Russians are trying to make, or Russian-affiliated channels or social media or whatever is trying to make, is that Ukraine deliberately targeted civilians. I don't think that's the case. Russia doesn't even think that's the case. However, if you look at the Sevastopol region here, you can very clearly see, and this is where the importance comes in for Americans who want to, if you want to cherry pick some information from the Ukraine war, this is a good lesson to learn. And that is that many, many, many times military targets are located right next to civilian targets. Okay, military sites are located next to civilian centers. So, as we can see here, we've got 3 gigantic major military facilities and very clear, valid military targets as far as warfare is concerned, and they're located right next to major civilian cities, or in the middle of major civilian cities. So again, this is one of those things where I don't want to get into it too much, but if you are, say, an American taxpayer that's trying to look forward to the next few years and sort of glean some information here and there, it would be very, very, very wise to understand the severity of war and how being located next to a decently large military target is probably not good for your health in the long term. I can tell you without question that if I was in Sevastopol, the Sevastopol region, they're right next to the naval base. There's like a yacht club, and they've got like nice fancy restaurants and all that kind of stuff there. I would absolutely not at all be purveying any of this sort of thing. You're not going to catch me laying on the beach right off the end of the runway of a major military airport, especially if the nation that you're in is, or the region you're in, is at war, you know. And I've really been trying to examine this to kind of glean some information here and there, so I'll just share my thoughts very briefly. I don't understand how or why a citizenry, be it Ukrainian or Russian in this case, ethnic Russian at least, I don't understand how they're not able to comprehend that their nation's at war. And you kind of see this in the Middle East too. You know, basically anywhere where there's a war going on, you know, you've got Ukrainians in Kiev partying it up in clubs every night. Missile sirens going off in the background. Same thing in Tel Aviv. You know, you've got this well, in the beginning you had sort of the same thing going on in Gaza to some degree. Not so much anymore. But anyway, I've really been trying to figure out why people are like this. Why do people do this? Is it a simple case of people not understanding where they are or what's going on, or just becoming more complacent? I don't understand. And it's probably more of, in this case, probably more of an Eastern European mindset. I mean, we all saw the images of when the initial invasion occurred in Ukraine, of Russians, invading, the eastern districts of Ukraine. We all saw the multiple videos of old babushkas sweeping the street, just continuing on, and there's tanks in the background. We saw the whole Myanmar video, right? The lady doing the whole sort of dance fitness class, and there's a coup going on in the background. I don't understand if it's people just not knowing what's going on here. I'm sure there's some kind of psychological element to it, but I would be very, very hard pressed to find a situation where I myself am in a nation where I can hear the thumping of artillery and I can see enemy aircraft dropping bombs on what I consider to be, my homeland if I'm living in an area. And I'm just going to, continue on like normal. I mean, I just find that very hard for me to imagine myself doing. But regardless of that, it's happening. You've got people laying on the beach getting hit with cluster bombs, So again, if you're an American and this has no familiarity to you, then maybe it would probably be good to just kind of, cherry pick some bits of knowledge in that your homeland can become a war zone very, very quickly. Maybe not overnight. I'm not going to say that, an American city is going to become Sevastopol overnight. That's, it's not going to happen. However, with the amount of cultural and social violence we have here in the United States, maybe it would be a good idea to start kind of realizing where we're at in many regards, especially when it comes to some of these more kinetic targeting concerns. But anyway, I think I've talked that one to death quite a bit, and let's briefly touch on Lebanon for a moment. Just because I wanted to kind of, again, talk a little bit more about it. I know people don't like it, but there's a general understanding throughout the international community that while the Israeli operation in Gaza is something that has largely been kind of ignored, at least on a very serious diplomatic front for a very long time. This is not really a new conflict. An Israeli operation in Lebanon, if it were to occur, this would be a very serious escalation. Lebanon is not Gaza, okay? It's not Gaza in the same regards. It's, obviously they're two different places on the map, But logistically speaking, militarily speaking, diplomatically speaking, they're very, very different places. Same thing with Hezbollah and Hamas. We've heard these terms being shouted by all sides during this conflict. Hezbollah and Hamas are not the same. Okay, they're two completely different organizations. They may have the same goals to some degree, but by and large, Hezbollah has got a lot more teeth than Hamas does for sure. And you also have to remember the power players in the region are also more heavily invested in Lebanon than in, say, a very small piece of land in Gaza, right? So, again, I know people don't care about it, and the people that do care about it are very strongly opinionated either way. I am more concerned about the conflict in the region from an American perspective, because I obviously am not there. There's only so much that I can know, or there's only so many decisions I can make in my own daily life that are affected by this, or the other way around, however you wanted to phrase it. So, generally speaking, there is a growing sentiment, I don't know how much I agree with it, but there's a growing sentiment that when Israel invades Lebanon, this will be a very strong catalyst for the conflict to expand greatly. I don't know how accurate that is. Israel, my assessment is that Israel's probably not going to do what they did in Gaza and Lebanon. Militarily speaking, I don't think they could do it very easily. And also, it's probably more likely for Israel to do what Israel does best, which is use a lot of deception in their way of war. That's just undisputedly, whatever you feel about the conflict, Israel is very, very good at waging information war, especially when it comes to like specific military deception. They'll pull troops out of an area and then put them in somewhere else, or they'll pull troops out of an area and then put them right back in the same area. So they're very good at that. And my guess is that militarily speaking, just purely militarily speaking, they would have the best shot at conducting some kind of border security operation along the Lebanese border, where a lot of the rockets from Hezbollah are being launched. Do a limited border security operation, and then probably roll that into something a little bit more. Go a few kilometers into Lebanon, into the sort of diplomatically ambiguous area there, and then just kind of expand it slowly without anyone noticing. We saw this in Gaza. They tried to sort of invade Gaza without anybody noticing, right? And that kind of worked to some degree in some areas, but again, I don't want to get into the technical details of this, because it's just a dumpster fire of a conflict now, and it's impossible. It is impossible to get to the truth with regards to what's going on there. So, again, bringing things back to a more American perspective, why do I care about this? Well, because I do think the potential for a widening conflict is there. I don't think it's going to start like a apocalypse, but I think it's going to affect the United States very severely. We already see this conflict affecting us via the Red Sea. Like I mentioned before, Red Sea traffic in the Red Sea has decreased by a little over 90%. So shipping costs will stabilize to some degree, and they kind of have once shipping companies sort of make allowances for the longer journey around the Cape of Good Hope and around the southern tip of Africa. But by and large, these wars can't go on forever, and there's going to have to be either a milestone reached to escalate them, or there's going to have to be some kind of equilibrium reached to where people don't care anymore. I don't know what's going to happen with Lebanon. I would say that it's not going to be as easy as Gaza if Israel really does want to pull this plug. Militarily speaking, just purely from a military, strategic, operational, tactical, sort of doctrine look, it's going to be very hard. It's going to be very hard for Israel to do anything in Lebanon. Really rugged terrain. It's a big country compared to Gaza, at least. You've got a heavily entrenched force that's been there a whole lot longer than Hamas has been in Gaza. They've got more solidified political leadership. They're more resistant to Israeli targeting. Israel's doctrine is mostly urban fighting, whereas in Lebanon there'd be a little bit more spread outness to the whole conflict. So, we could talk for hours about it if people actually were able to understand what's going on there. But again, I just don't think it's worth wasting anybody's time, especially considering that the truth is so hard to get to. nowadays with regards to this conflict. But anyway, I know I rambled on way too much already, so let's go ahead and wrap things up with the intercepted GhostNet reports for this week. Again, every week that I tune in to the GhostNet sort of communications window, I'm really humbled by how many people have decided to try to take steps to improve their resiliency of information. And this week was no different, right? So we've got a couple of different reports. First of all, I'm not putting on the screen. I put there were a lot of new check-ins, people checking in saying, NSTR, nothing significant to report, saying, I'm here, I'm listening, but there's, I don't have anything to say. That's fine. I don't put those on the slide just because there's so many of them. But I did want to mention that a couple people were talking about the Minnesota flooding situation, and there was somebody talking about the cyber attack on automotive shops from a couple weeks back. But there was also a few more cyber attacks or cyber incidents that haven't really been confirmed as a cyber attack, but just people kind of mentioning that. I only caught kind of like the tail end of a few other reports, but yeah, I did want to mention that this is definitely working. I know it's not perfect. I know there's much more efficient ways of doing things, but there's a plan here, and we're moving towards it. So it's working out pretty good, I think. And I know that it can be exceptionally frustrating for a lot of people who don't understand radio, or they may understand radio as far as like a Baofeng goes. They can go on Amazon and buy that, no problem, $20-$40, and they're good to go. They understand that much, but HF radio, high frequency radio, shortwave radio, that's a whole other animal. I get it. I really do. So I'm working on some stuff to kind of help, make this a little bit easier for all of you out there. So that's all I have for today. Here are the sources for this time around. It's summer's heating up. Things are getting pretty busy out there in many regards. And I just hope we're able to kind of stay a little bit more proactive instead of just reacting to the news all the time. But that's sometimes a bridge too far, I guess. But anyway, that's pretty much all I have for today. I think we'll roll things up, and we'll see what we can do next week. So we'll be right back at it with the shorter wire reports on Monday, and we'll see what next week brings. So thank you all for watching. Thank you all for your support. It really does mean a lot. I know I don't say it enough, but I really do mean it. But I wouldn't be able to do any of this stuff without your support. So thank you again for that, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.